Have you ever paused to consider the quiet moments that make up your day? The seemingly insignificant gestures, a smile offered to a stranger, a word of kindness whispered in passing, the simple act of listening with full attention. These tiny ripples, often overlooked, carry a power far greater than we tend to imagine. In a world that glorifies the monumental, the big achievements, the grand milestones, it's easy to forget the profound meaning woven into the fabric of our everyday actions. But what if the secret to a truly meaningful life isn't in the extraordinary, but in the ordinary? What if the little things, done consistently and with heart, hold the key to a life rich with purpose and connection? This idea isn't just a feel-good notion. It's a timeless truth echoed across cultures and ages, deeply embedded in the wisdom of Buddhism. Long before self-help books and motivational speeches, the Buddha taught that each small act matters. Every thought, word, and deed plants a seed that grows and blossoms in ways we often cannot immediately see. Imagine your life as a vast pond. When you toss a pebble into it, ripples spread far beyond the spot where it landed. In much the same way, your small actions send waves through your life and the lives of others, shaping not only your present but the future you and those around you will live. Yet in our fast-paced, distracted world, it's easy to lose sight of this. We get caught up chasing big goals and instant results, neglecting the quiet power of presence and intention in the little things. But this is where the heart of meaningful living lies, in embracing the small moments with awareness, kindness, and care. Consider the simple act of helping someone carry their groceries or holding the door open for a stranger. These moments may seem minor, even trivial, but they are expressions of compassion. They bridge the gaps between people, reminding us of our shared humanity. And when done mindfully, they become acts of generosity not just outwardly but inwardly, cultivating peace and joy within ourselves. Buddhist philosophy reminds us that nothing exists in isolation. We are all interconnected, woven together in a complex web of cause and effect. The smallest act, done with sincerity, can initiate a chain of positive change within our hearts, our communities, and the wider world. This perspective transforms how we view daily life. It invites us to slow down, to notice the texture of our interactions, and to honor the potential held in each breath, each gesture, each choice. It turns routine into ritual and habit into meaningful practice. Over the course of this exploration, we'll delve into how these small acts serve as the building blocks of a life well lived. We'll uncover the Buddhist teachings that illuminate this truth and hear stories, both ancient and modern, that bring it to life. We'll explore practical ways to cultivate mindfulness and compassion in everyday moments, turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Most importantly, this journey invites you to see yourself not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in the unfolding story of your life. Every small act you commit is a brushstroke on the canvas of your existence. Together, these strokes create a masterpiece of meaning, resilience, and love. So, let's begin by opening our eyes to the hidden power of small acts and discovering how these gentle waves shape the course of our lives in ways both subtle and profound. There's a quiet magic woven into the fabric of Buddhist philosophy, a wisdom that reveals how even the smallest gestures echo through the vast web of existence. To truly understand the power behind small acts, we need to step into this ancient worldview, where every moment, every action, ripples across time and space in ways we may never fully grasp. At the heart of Buddhism lies the principle of karma, often misunderstood as a simple ledger of good and bad deeds. But karma is far more profound. It's the natural law of cause and effect, the intricate dance of actions and consequences that shape our experiences. Every thought we entertain, every word we speak, every act we perform plants a seed. These seeds sprout in the fertile soil of our lives, blossoming into realities that reflect the intentions behind them. What's fascinating is how this principle elevates the ordinary. No action is too small to matter. The brushstroke of kindness, the gentle word of encouragement, the mindful choice to act ethically. Each one holds the potential to transform the world within and around us. This understanding invites us to see life as an ongoing journey of cultivation. The Buddha taught the Noble Eightfold Path, a practical guide to living wisely and compassionately. Among its steps, right action reminds us to engage in behavior that causes no harm and nurtures well-being. But right action isn't reserved for grand gestures. It's practiced in the everyday, in the way we treat family, colleagues, strangers, and even ourselves. And then there's the heart of Buddhist ethics, compassion and loving kindness, known as Karu letter 1E47A Macron and Metta. These aren't lofty ideals confined to monks or sages. They are qualities anyone can cultivate, starting with small acts that soften the edges of our busy lives and open us to deeper connection. When we extend kindness without expectation, even in subtle ways, we participate in healing the fractures that separate us. Consider the story of the Buddha himself, who, before his awakening, was deeply moved by the suffering he witnessed. His journey began with compassion for all beings, sparked by simple observations and a resolve to respond with care. His teachings echo this emphasis. Meaningful change begins not with sweeping revolutions, but with steady, mindful acts. In this light, each moment becomes sacred. Washing dishes mindfully is no longer a chore, but an offering. Listening attentively is a gift. Helping another, even in ways that seem small, is a step on the path to liberation, both theirs and ours. This philosophy also shines a light on interdependence, the idea that nothing exists independently. We are part of a vast interconnected whole. Our actions influence others, just as theirs influence us. This web of life reminds us that small acts can resonate far beyond what we see. A smile might ease someone's pain. A kind word might inspire a new path. A simple gesture of patience might diffuse a tense moment. Understanding this network of causes and conditions encourages humility and responsibility. We realize that by nurturing positive seeds through our small acts, we contribute to a more compassionate, harmonious world. But it's not only about the external impact. These acts shape who we become. Practicing kindness, honesty, and care rewires our hearts and minds, making us more peaceful and resilient. The journey of small acts is also a journey inward, towards awakening and true freedom. So, as we navigate our daily lives, remembering these teachings grounds us. They call us to be present and intentional. They transform how we see ourselves and our place in the world, not as isolated individuals, but as threads in a vast, living tapestry. This understanding sets the stage for something truly transformative. The ability to live meaningfully, moment by moment, through the power of small acts. It's a promise that you don't have to wait for the big, dramatic moments to find purpose. Instead, purpose arises naturally when you commit to the small, conscious choices that align with wisdom and compassion. As we move forward, we'll explore how mindfulness breathes life into these acts, turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Because in the end, it's not just what we do, but how deeply we engage with the moment that shapes the meaning of our lives. There's a secret ingredient that transforms small acts from mere motions into moments of profound meaning: mindfulness. It's the simple, yet powerful practice of being fully present, awake, and aware in each instant. When we bring mindfulness to our daily actions, even the smallest gestures become infused with depth and purpose. In the rush of life, it's easy to move on autopilot, washing dishes, while our minds drift to tomorrow's worries, or nodding absent-mindedly during a conversation. These moments slip by unnoticed, and with them, the chance to connect deeply with ourselves and others. But mindfulness invites us to slow down and truly inhabit our experience. It's not about emptying the mind or escaping reality. Rather, it's about embracing reality with openness and clarity. This presence lets us notice the textures of life, the warmth of sunlight on our skin, the subtle rise and fall of our breath, the flicker of emotion in someone's eyes. When applied to small acts, mindfulness shifts the energy behind them. A simple cup of tea becomes a ceremony of care. A word spoken with attention becomes a bridge of connection. The smallest act, when performed mindfully, becomes a seed of awakening. Buddhist teachings call mindfulness sati, a steady, unshakable awareness rooted in compassion. This practice is at the core of the four foundations of mindfulness, which guide us to observe the body, feelings, mind, and phenomena with gentle curiosity. Through this lens, every action is an opportunity for insight and growth. The beauty of mindfulness is that it's accessible to everyone, anytime, anywhere. You don't need special tools or a perfect setting. You only need a willingness to return your attention to the present moment again and again. Think about the last time you were truly present. Maybe it was watching a child play, feeling the earth beneath your feet during a walk, or sharing a genuine laugh with a friend. Those moments linger because they touch something real inside us, a sense of aliveness and belonging. In cultivating mindfulness, we create space between stimulus and response. This space is where freedom grows. Instead of reacting out of habit or frustration, we respond with clarity and kindness. Mindful awareness softens the edges of stress and judgment, allowing compassion to bloom. In practical terms, this means when you help someone, you do so with your full heart and attention. When you face a challenge, you meet it with steady calm. When you experience joy, you savor it fully. Every moment becomes an opportunity to deepen your connection to life and to the people around you. Scientific research also highlights mindfulness's profound impact. Studies show it reduces stress, enhances emotional regulation, and fosters empathy, all qualities that enrich our small acts of kindness and care. But beyond science, the lived experience of mindfulness brings a quiet joy and resilience that transforms ordinary days into a meaningful journey. As you begin to weave mindfulness into your daily life, you may notice subtle shifts. You become more attuned to your inner world and more sensitive to the needs of others. Small acts become a source of nourishment, both for you and the world you touch. This chapter invites you to experiment with mindfulness as a way to bring depth to your everyday life. Start by simply noticing your breath or the sensations in your body. Let your awareness ripple outwards to the actions you take, however small. Notice how this changes the quality of your experience. In this way, mindfulness becomes a foundation for living with intention and heart. It's the gentle pulse behind every meaningful act, the thread that connects moments into a tapestry of purpose. As we continue, we'll explore how compassion, the natural companion of mindfulness, breathes life into our small acts, turning simple gestures into profound expressions of love and healing. Sometimes, the most profound lessons come not from lofty teachings, but from simple stories, moments when small acts ripple outwards and create waves of change, touching lives in unexpected ways. These stories are the heartbeats of our shared humanity, reminding us that even the tiniest gestures can transform worlds. Imagine a young monk in a small village who, every morning, quietly sweeps the temple courtyard. To outsiders, it seems a humble task, dusting dirt and fallen leaves. But his act is a meditation in motion, a symbol of respect and care. Years later, visitors come to that temple feeling a rare peace, drawn by the calm that radiates from such devoted care. What began as a simple sweeping became a silent teaching on mindfulness and devotion. Or think about the story of a woman who, during a busy commute, offered her seat to an elderly stranger. That brief moment of kindness sparked a chain reaction. The stranger smiled warmly. A fellow passenger witnessed the act and decided to volunteer at a local shelter. Small acts like these are quiet revolutions, spreading compassion without fanfare. There's also the story of a teacher who, overwhelmed by the challenges in her classroom, decided to greet each student with a smile every day. That smile became a beacon, helping shy children find their voice and creating a safe space where learning could flourish. One student later said that simple smile saved her life. Such is the power of small acts woven with genuine care. In Buddhist tradition, these stories echo the parables the Buddha shared, simple tales that reveal profound truths. One famous story tells of the mustard seed, where a mother's grief over her lost child is met with the Buddha's gentle guidance. No household is free from suffering, just as no mustard seed is free from imperfection. This small teaching offers immense comfort and perspective, showing how small insights can shift our entire worldview. These stories remind us that impact is not measured by size or recognition, but by intention and connection. When we act from a place of presence and compassion, the effects transcend the immediate moment. Like a pebble tossed into a still pond, our small acts send ripples far beyond our sight. What's more, these stories show that anyone can be a catalyst for change. Not only spiritual leaders or heroes, but ordinary people living ordinary lives. Each of us carries the potential to spark kindness, healing, and transformation through mindful, small gestures. When you consider your own life, you'll find countless opportunities for such acts. A listening ear for a troubled friend, a kind word to a coworker, a patient breath before responding in anger, all seeds planted in the fertile soil of everyday life. And these stories aren't just inspiring anecdotes. They serve as practical reminders that change is possible here and now, through acts within our reach. They invite us to shift our focus from waiting for grand moments to recognizing the sacred potential in each simple choice. As these stories unfold, they create a tapestry of hope, weaving together individual threads of kindness into a fabric strong enough to support communities, heal wounds, and nurture peace. The real magic lies in recognizing that your small acts are part of this larger story, a story of compassion, resilience, and transformation that spans generations. As we reflect on these stories, we begin to see our own lives differently. We realize that meaning is created not by monumental deeds, but by the accumulation of small, conscious actions performed with heart. With this understanding, the next step is to explore how cultivating compassion deepens the power of these acts, making our lives and the world around us richer and more vibrant. Behind every small act lies not only ancient wisdom, but also a fascinating web of science and psychology that reveals why these simple gestures carry such profound power. When we understand the mechanics beneath the surface, we see how kindness and mindfulness don't just feel good. They actually reshape our brains, emotions, and social world. Modern research confirms what Buddhist philosophy has known for millennia. Small acts of kindness and presence trigger a cascade of positive effects inside us and in the people around us. Let's start with the brain. When you perform a kind act, whether it's smiling at a stranger, offering a helping hand, or simply listening, your brain releases a cocktail of feel-good chemicals. Dopamine, often called the reward molecule, floods your system, giving you a natural high, a sense of satisfaction and joy. Oxytocin, known as the love hormone, strengthens bonds and fosters trust. Endorphins, the body's natural painkillers, lift your mood and reduce stress. This biochemical response is no accident. Evolution has wired us to thrive on social connection and mutual care because these small acts build community and cooperation, essential for survival. But the impact goes deeper than individual neurochemistry. Psychologists describe something called the helper's high, a euphoric state accompanied by increased energy and a decreased perception of pain, experienced by people who engage in acts of kindness. This phenomenon reveals that helping others literally feels good to us, reinforcing a cycle of generosity. There's also the ripple effect. Studies show that kindness is contagious. When someone witnesses an act of compassion, their brain lights up in areas associated with reward and empathy, making them more likely to pay it forward. This creates a chain reaction, where one small act multiplies into many, amplifying its impact far beyond the initial gesture. Science also reveals how small acts affect our mental health. Simple expressions of gratitude, generosity, and mindfulness reduce anxiety and depression, increase resilience, and enhance overall well-being. By focusing on positive interactions, we rewire our brains to notice more of what's good in life, a phenomenon called positive neuroplasticity. Moreover, small acts help cultivate emotional regulation. When we pause to be present and act with kindness, we create a buffer against impulsive reactions fueled by stress or anger. This practice strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for self-control and decision-making, making us more patient, compassionate, and wise. These findings are echoed in the practice of mindful meditation, which has been shown to alter brain structure and function in ways that support emotional balance and empathy. So the ancient Buddhist teachings about mindfulness and compassion are now validated by modern neuroscience. But beyond the individual, small acts strengthen social bonds. Humans are inherently social creatures, wired for connection. Small gestures like a smile, a nod, or a helping hand communicate safety and belonging. These signals build trust and cooperation, creating resilient communities. In the context of Buddhist practice, this scientific perspective aligns beautifully with the understanding of interconnectedness. The idea that our actions affect not only ourselves, but everyone around us. Small acts ripple through the web of life, influencing countless others in ways we might never see. What's remarkable is how accessible this power is. You don't need to change the world in a grand way to make a difference. Your everyday actions, grounded in kindness and presence, are enough to spark transformation inside and out. As we deepen our understanding of the science and psychology behind small acts, we see that they are not just moral niceties, but essential tools for personal and collective flourishing. With this knowledge, we become empowered to choose our actions consciously, knowing that even the smallest gesture carries immense potential. Next, we'll dive into how to nurture these qualities in ourselves, turning simple intentions into lasting habits that shape a meaningful life. Knowing the power behind small acts is one thing, living it day by day is another. How do we transform this beautiful wisdom into concrete actions that shape our lives and the world around us? How do we bridge the gap between understanding and doing? The answer lies in simple, mindful choices, small, consistent acts that, over time, build a meaningful life rooted in compassion and presence. First, start with awareness. Begin each day with the intention to notice opportunities for kindness and mindfulness. It could be as simple as taking a breath before speaking, offering a genuine smile, or listening fully when someone shares their story. These moments, though small, become the building blocks of deeper connection. Try to slow down. In our fast-paced world, rushing often blinds us to these chances. Slowing down allows us to be present, to see the needs of others and ourselves. It opens space for thoughtful action rather than reactive habits. One powerful practice is random acts of kindness. These are spontaneous, unplanned gestures holding the door open, giving a sincere compliment, or helping someone carry a heavy load. They awaken generosity and remind us of our shared humanity. Another practical way is gratitude journaling, a daily habit of writing down 3 things you're thankful for. This simple act rewires your brain to focus on positivity, enhancing your mood and resilience, and inspiring more kindness outward. Mindful listening is equally transformative. When we listen deeply, without judgment or interruption, we give others the gift of presence. This small act fosters trust and healing in relationships, creating ripples far beyond the moment. Don't overlook self-compassion. Caring for yourself through gentle words, rest, or mindful breathing refuels your ability to give to others. The Buddhist principle of loving kindness begins at home. In community, small acts multiply. Volunteer your time, share skills, or support causes you believe in. Even small contributions weave into the fabric of collective well-being. Importantly, embrace imperfection. Sometimes small acts don't go as planned. Maybe a smile isn't returned, or a kind word is misunderstood. These moments are part of the journey. Keep practicing with patience and an open heart. Remember, living meaningfully isn't about grand gestures, but about the accumulation of simple choices made with intention. Each act plants a seed of peace, love, or healing that grows quietly within and around us. As you weave these practices into daily life, you'll begin to notice subtle shifts. More joy in the mundane, deeper connections, and a growing sense of purpose that doesn't depend on external success. This path invites you to live fully, embracing the present moment with kindness, presence, and courage. And so, as these small acts ripple outward, they remind us of our true nature, compassionate, interconnected, and capable of profound transformation. From here, we return to the beginning, reflecting on how these simple choices bring meaning to our journey, the very essence of living fully and well. As we come full circle on this journey, it becomes clear. Living meaningfully doesn't require grand gestures or extraordinary circumstances. It thrives in the quiet power of small acts, moments of kindness, presence, and compassion that, like pebbles dropped into a still pond, create ripples far beyond what we can see. Each small act carries within it the potential to transform not only the lives of others but our own. When we choose to smile, listen, or simply be present, we tap into a profound current that connects us all, a current recognized by the Buddha's timeless wisdom and now illuminated by modern science. This ripple effect is both humbling and empowering. We may never witness the full reach of our actions, but we can trust that every gesture, no matter how small, sends waves through the interconnected web of life. In this understanding, our daily lives become sacred practice. The mundane tasks, the brief encounters, the simple choices, all are opportunities to embody meaning and compassion. This is the essence of a Buddhist approach to living, to see each moment as a chance to awaken and to nurture the world around us. The ripple effect also invites patience and faith. Change often happens slowly, quietly, like a seed growing underground before breaking the surface. Small acts, accumulated over time, cultivate a life rich with purpose and connection. So, as you move forward, remember that your actions matter, not because they are large or recognized, but because they are rooted in genuine intention and mindful presence. This is the legacy of small acts, a legacy of love, healing, and hope that transcends boundaries and generations. In embracing this path, you participate in something far greater than yourself. You join a timeless current of compassion that flows through human history, binding us to one another in shared humanity. May this awareness inspire you to live each day with heart and purpose, knowing that through small acts, you contribute to a world more kind, more awake, and more alive. Thank you for walking this path together. The journey continues, one small act at a time.